Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. This is our weekly Chats on the Past program where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Nicole Carpenter and I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, we are, of course, pleased to offer all of our programs for free. We do have a suggested donation of $5 for all of these programs, but we understand that this is a very difficult time. We ask that you support the museum however you can, and this includes liking and following us on all of our social media handles. This also lets you know when we are holding programs in the future. At Facebook and Twitter, you can follow us at Westport History and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. If you have any questions or comments, anecdotes that you would like to share during our program this evening, please enter them in the comments box, which I will be monitoring during our program, and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end of our program tonight. This evening, I am joined by Regina Mason, who is an international speaker who's appeared on C-SPAN's Book TV and NPR All Things Considered. She's also an author whose essays have appeared in the Race Card Project and The Root. She also performs The Raw Truth, which is an acclaimed one-woman show, and she is the executive producer of the award-winning feature documentary Ginas Journey, The Search for William Grimes. This film was presented in Westport during the museum's exhibition Remembered: The History of African Americans in 2018. Regina has spent 15 years researching the life of her 3 times great-grandfather, the pioneering fugitive slave autobiographer William Grimes, who we're going to discuss this evening. And she, along with William L. Andrews, is the co-editor of the 2008 edition of The Life of William Grimes, The Runaway Slave. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Regina. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm happy to be working with you and Ramin again. And I thank you for this invitation. I do want to say a couple things. I want people to understand I'm not a scholar, okay? The book that I published with or edited with Dr. William L. Andrews represents a unique partnership. He is a scholar of early African-American autobiography, and he reached out to me to partner after I had been over maybe 2 or 3 years sharing information with him about William Grimes. And Bill Andrews was really the only living scholar that had written at length about William Grimes, which amounted to 2 or 3 pages. And I reached out to him many years ago. This is back in the early 1990s. And I wanted to know more about William Grimes. Nobody was studying his narrative, but there I was plugging along, trying to make sense of this man's words and figure out if he was related to me. And lo and behold, after several years of research, the family lore that my Aunt Catherine left with me when I was about 10 years old actually turned out to be true. She told me that there was someone in the family who had a mysterious connection to the Underground Railroad, and that his name was Grimes. He was from New Haven, Connecticut, and he had escaped slavery in some way. I wanted to know who this man was, and what she told me amounted to 3 little clues: the surname of Grimes, the Underground Railroad, and the fact that this person was from New Haven, Connecticut. So fast forward 20 some years, I go on a hunt to find this man. And lo and behold, I do find him. I find him in Charles L. Blockson's book, The Underground Railroad, which talked about a slave who escaped slavery from Savannah, Georgia, and was directed on foot by people associated with the Underground Railroad, directing him to New Haven, Connecticut. So Blockson had no footnotes, but he had a bibliography, and that bibliography said that this William Grimes person wrote his life story and published it himself. I needed to find that book, so I went on a hunt and I did find it. So with that in mind, long story short, there was a family Bible that surfaced. No one knew about it, but my Aunt Catherine did. And while I'm going on this hunt, not able to link William Grimes to my genealogy, she delivers a family Bible that shows William Grimes and the death date of August 21st, 1865. Well, I had begun doing newspaper searches, and I found an obituary, and it linked up with the death date of William Grimes. And so he turned out to be my great-great-grandfather. With that in mind, I had not had any inkling about slave narratives. I had read two, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, but I didn't know anything about that genre of literature. And it was Bill Andrews that sort of took me under his wing, and he and I would later partner. So the book, Life of William Grimes, a Runaway Slave, is in three voices. The first voice that you will get is Dr. Bill Andrews, and he sets the tone for this narrative in time and place. He puts it in literary and historical context. The next voice is the unabridged narrative of life of William Grimes, the runaway slave. The final voice is my journey to discover this narrative. And a few years ago, a producer by the name of Sean Durant from the Bay Area approached me about making a documentary. We didn't know how we were going to get it done. I didn't turn down the offer, and we made it happen through a number of resources, crowdfunding and what have you. So I'm going to hold up a copy of Ginas Journey, The Search for William Grimes, because if you haven't seen it, I would love for you all to go to ginasjourney.com and read about the documentary and support it. This was a film made for the people, by the people. So now let's get into talking about William Grimes. I want to dedicate this talk to the memory of George Floyd and Eric Gardner, whose last words were, "I can't breathe." I've come to realize that those words are a metaphor for the life of William Grimes, who wrote his story in 1855, 195 years ago. And that story is very relevant today. So in Grimes's memoir, he talks about the plantation system. He talks about the jail system in Savannah, Georgia, which is in an urban setting. He has 10 masters. 5 of them were from Virginia, and they were all interconnected, all related to the Stewart and Thornton family. He is then sold further south to Savannah, Georgia, where it is a different kind of slavery, but just as cruel and barbaric as plantation slavery as well. His father, he writes about, but not directly. It's indirectly that he speaks of his father. And I've been able to connect the dots. He doesn't name him, but his father is Benjamin Grimes, who was a wealthy white planter on the estate Eagle's Nest in King George, Virginia. His mother remains an unknown enslaved woman who was owned by Dr. Stewart on a neighboring plantation. And in the South, if you know anything about the history, the slave child follows the condition of the mother. And therefore, even though William Grimes's father was a wealthy planter, he was owned by Dr. Stewart, and thus the property of Dr. Stewart. Benjamin Grimes never buys his son. So with that in mind, right off the bat, the Grimes narrative opens in a sarcastic way that I actually am going to read to you. He says, to the public, those who wish to know who Grimes is and what is his history, he would tell them that he is generally living in Litchfield, Connecticut. And by the way, this is the preface of his book, and it tells the circumstances of his life in a nutshell. He said that he is now living in Litchfield, Connecticut, that he's about 40 years of age, that he's married to a Black woman, although passes for a Negro, being 3 parts white. That he was born in a place of Virginia, has lived in several different states, and had been owned by 10 different masters. That about 10 years since, he ran away, came to Connecticut, where after 6 years, he was recognized by some of his former master's friends, taken up and compelled to purchase his freedom with the sacrifice of all he had earned. Let anyone suppose himself a husband, a father, possessed of a house, home, and livelihood. A stranger enters that house before his children, and in fair daylight puts the chain on his leg, where it remains till the last cent of his property, buys from avarice and cruelty the remnant of a life whose best years had been spent in misery. Let anyone imagine this and think what I have felt. William Grimes, Litchfield, Connecticut, October 1st, 1824. So that allows you to see what he was going through. After living for so many years in Connecticut, because he does steal away from slavery, he is faced with a real life dilemma. His master finds him, and by this time, he's a property owner, he's married, and he has children. But he has to give up the deed to his house in order to have freedom. So what did he have left? The only thing he had left was his voice. So he chronicles it in his story. He opens his book with biting sarcasm. He said, I was born in the year 1784 in the county of King George, Virginia, in a land boasting its freedom and under a government whose motto is liberty and equality, yet I was born a slave. As I mentioned earlier, William Grimes was owned by Dr. Stewart. He was sold away from the arms of his grieving mother at 10 years of age to a far-off plantation where he knew nobody. In fact, he grew up like a wild weed with no enslaved family to embrace him. It actually was survival of the fittest on the plantation. He talks about being sabotaged in the house by the cook, because she wanted her boy in the position that William had, which was serving coffee for the master and the mistress. He begged then to be sent on the field because he thought he could fare better there. But in reality, he said he suffered everything but death himself. Or itself, I should say. He talks about the brutality of the overseer on the plantation. And I'm going to read an excerpt from that. He said, I remained on the plantation about 2 years under a Black overseer by the name of Valentine, who punished me repeatedly to make me perform more labor than the rest of the boys. My master then procured another overseer, a white man by the name of Coleman Thied. He treated me somewhat a little better than Valentine, but he was also very severe and flogged me several times for almost nothing. The overseers have an unlimited control over the slaves on the plantation and exercise their authority in the most tyrannical manner. My master gave me many floggings, but I had rather be whipped by him than the overseer, and especially the Black overseers. Oh, how much I suffered from the Black drivers. So I found that so interesting to hear, because this was an example of Black policing. It was an example of having control over the slaves on the plantation. It was, in a sense of brutality and control, which has been the story of the African American experience when it comes to jail, when it comes to incarceration. And we can definitely make a connection. We can even make an even greater connection when you look at urban slavery in Savannah, which I will also get into in a few minutes. But William Grimes decided as a 12-year-old that he was going to run away because the brutality on the plantation was so severe. But there was, when he talked about it with a older enslaved gentleman, and that slave ended up telling the master. So his plan to run away was foiled. And he, even though he talked about it, he didn't attempt to at that time. He received a beating for it. The reality of plantation slavery for William Grimes in Virginia under the ownership of the Thornton family was very cruel. It wasn't until Philip Thornton, who was an older brother of Colonel Thornton, who initially owned William Grimes, that he was able to get a sense of a much broader world outside of the plantation. William Grimes was very good with horses, and he eventually became a coachman. And Dr. Philip Thornton allowed him to be his coachman and to care for his horses. Dr. Thornton was a traveling doctor, so William Grimes got to see a bigger world than the one on the Thornton plantation. So naturally, he had to be suited up for the appearance of being acceptable in society. So Dr. Thornton dressed him up in such finery, and he was able to have a little bit of mobility. And Colonel Thornton's son, Philip, would be his last Virginia owner before being sold deeper south to Savannah, Georgia. And then while he was in Georgia, he worked among the elite as a coachman and as someone who took care of horses. He talks about the cruelty of, even though he had mobility, which was great, but William Grimes was a rebellious slave. He was always easy to brawl, always in having encounters with those who were enslaved. And at times he challenged his master. And in fact, it was when he decided that he was going to approach his master to ask him to sell him, that the master became enraged and threw him in jail. So I want you to get a taste of what urban jail was like. While I was in confinement, I myself, as well as the other prisoners, were used to the sound of, oh, pray, which came from those poor slaves, then in preparation for being whipped, or experiencing then at the same time the smart of the lash, which was so often used without mercy. As large, stout, and athletic a Negro as I was ever acquainted with was selected for the purpose of whipping those who were doomed to receive the lash. He himself being there confined for some crime he had committed. In a case of whipping, he was compelled to put it on very severely as lay in his power, or take a severe flogging himself. I, at this time, was in such dread of the whipping post, where I daily saw so many human beings sacrificed to the lash of the tyrant, that it struck me with such horror. I prayed constantly to my God, who had relieved me before in the hour of danger, to protect and defend me in this adversity. Being now in a prison from whence I knew no means of escape. William Grimes remained in that prison for 8 months. His master, so angry at him for asking to be sold, he was waiting for a ship to perhaps sell William Grimes. Well, it turns out that that ship never arrived, and he did release William Grimes out of prison because he needed help with his yard and so on and so forth. But in time, William Grimes would have a total of 10 masters, and his final master was a Dr. Wellman. And he and Dr. Wellman got along fairly well. He actually gave William Grimes freedom and to hire his time, which meant to go work from someone else, and then he would have to pay his master his earnings. And on this particular day, William Grimes went down to the harbor while his master was in Bermuda, and he decided to work with with sailors bailing cotton onto the Casket, which was a brig out of Boston. And one of the members said to, one of the sailors said to him, well, you know, we can leave a space for you on board and you can perhaps stow away. So they planted an idea in William Grimes's head, and he actually decided to do it. And that's how he made his escape from Savannah, Georgia to actually New York City. And while in New York, he was put in contact with those who worked for supposedly the Underground Railroad, but actually the Grimes story predates that movement. But anyway, he did write about how he was helped or directed on foot to New Haven, Connecticut. And I gotta say this to you, it's very strange just talking to a screen. I don't get to see everybody, and this Zoom situation is actually new for me, so please bear with me. I'm used to having an audience, live audience, and able to interact. So William Grimes makes his way to the north, to Connecticut, to New Haven, Connecticut, and there he becomes part of the working class, always trying to carve out a life for himself and always competing with poor white people. Dr. Andrews likened it to being on a perpetual treadmill of poverty. But William Grimes got lucky. He became a barber, which was a skilled profession. And so he ended up having the ability to make money. He decided, because he was always spotted by people from the South who actually knew him. And at this time, he's working as a servant at Yale College. He's working, eventually he's working in Litchfield, Connecticut, where he heard that a barber was needed. And he decided that he would go there, and Litchfield was considered the backcountry, and he thought maybe he would be able to lie low and not be seen by people that actually knew him. So he was a barber at the Litchfield Law School, which is the first of its kind in the nation. And there, for the first time, he is in this intellectual world. He is meeting students from the North and the South, because this gave those students an opportunity to study law, to become lawyers. So certainly he had to hear quite a bit. And he often talks or writes about in his book how he was always fighting for just to stay in a particular area because he could be warned out of town. And there was always someone inventing something about him because they were very jealous. But still, William Grimes accumulated money and he eventually bought property. And unfortunately, he would have to surrender that property when his master finds him. So I want to read to you, though, what it felt like, what it did to his psyche to be constantly apprehended, or in fear, I should say, of apprehension. He was always looking over his shoulder, always thinking that somebody was hot on his trail, and his worst nightmare comes true. I'm going to read to you what that felt like, and it kind of reminded me of what we see today when we are fearful of, when Black people are fearful of encounters with police officers. I'm talking about marginal people who may have already had a record or for some slight offense, which is what William Grimes had as well. Since he was in court, sometimes he would lose his battles, other times he would not. He spent time in the jail. So there was real fear of being encountered with police officers. He says this: I had at this time become more and more alarmed about being taken up and carried back to my master, which was one of the reasons why I left New Haven for Litchfield. My wife's mother came down to see her, and she went home with her and came down in a wagon after me. And as I was walking in the street that evening, she came, and I thought I heard the constable say, "After me," and Mr. Sturgis, who formerly owned me. I thought I heard him say, "Well, that fellow ran away from Savannah." I was so frightened my strength left me, but I began to run. I stopped at Lanson's and left word for my wife, and then went on as swift as a deer over the fences. I never thought where I was going. I traveled until 2 or 3 o'clock. Oh, how the sweat did run off of me. I crept inside a barn and slept. And the next day I arrived at Middlebury, where I went to work among the farmers until I left for Litchfield. There were times when William Grimes was so afraid of being captured that he would just pack up and leave his family and go to another state in New England. And he always ran into somebody, or someone heard someone was looking for him. So the fear was real. And of course, the nightmare came to fruition when his master sent an emissary to him and said, gave him an ultimatum: either you pay for your property or be sent back to Savannah in chains. Well, we know that he gave up his property, but in doing so, that left him penniless and his family in the street. He concludes his narrative with such biting sarcasm, the same way that he opened his story. And he says this: I hope some will buy my books from charity, but I am no beggar. I am now entirely destitute of property. Where and how I shall live, I don't know. Where and how I shall die, I don't know. But I hope that I may be prepared. If it were not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would, in my will, leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of glorious, happy, and free America. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of American liberty. And I think I will let William Grimes have the last word and will now open it up for questions.
Thank you, Regina. I saw the documentary Gina's Journey, and I was wondering if you would tell our audience just a little bit more about your process of finding William's story, because it is such a powerful, powerful story.
Yes, I spent 15 years researching this man's life. And this is all pre-internet. So, you can imagine how difficult that was. I spent hours upon hours in archives across the country, archives in my own backyard, trying to give this man his due. His book lay dormant for nearly 200 years until I came along and gave it new life. And that is, I guess, my greatest mission is to give voice to those who were deemed voiceless. So I began the research process, which wasn't easy. And then when the digital age came in the early 2000s, well, actually a little later than that, I was able to find even more information out about William Grimes and how his book was sold. And I came upon this incredible man who had such tenacity, who never gave up, and who was a savvy businessman who was also exposed to print culture. In Savannah, he worked for a printer. So he knew the power of advertising in newspapers, and he did that. He also had examples from an African-American by the name of William Lanson, who advertised for his businesses in New Haven, Connecticut. So the process was definitely to do the due diligence and the research in the archives, and you just can't get around it. You cannot, in giving voice to these to the voiceless.
You talk about not having the internet to do your research, which I can understand is very difficult, working with some of these databases without the convenience of digital searches.
Yes.
Are there other struggles that you faced in bringing your grandfather's story to light other than research challenges?
Oh, absolutely. I wasn't taken seriously. I'm not an academic. I was not trained in writing. Although I tried for a very long time to get published, it wasn't until I reached out to Bill Andrews, who saw the value of the bounty of my work. It said, look, we need to team up. He was definitely the right man for the job. I had talked with other scholars before him, but no one took me seriously. But again, Bill did. So that was a huge challenge that I had to overcome. And partnering with him, it was great because he contextualizes the narrative for everyone. He puts it in historical and literary perspective, something that I could not have done. So it was definitely a great partnership.
We have a comment and then a question from Ginas, who is listening this evening. First, she shares that she has a slave narrative for her second great-grandmother, And she's working on a similar project to you of trying to find her story. Her grandmother was 97, apparently, she says here. And her question was, after discovering Grimes's narrative and reading it, how did you feel? She says that after reading about her second great-grandmother that she cried. And is it an emotional experience reading about William?
I still shed tears. His book, nothing I had ever read on slavery prepared me for the narrative written by William Grimes. Nothing prepared me. And to read this man's narrative, not knowing if he was related to me, I wept for him then. But my goodness, when I was able to connect the dots and realize that this was in fact my flesh and blood, it took on a very personal and deeply emotional perspective. This was real. This was not someone else's life. It wasn't in the abstract. It was upfront and personal, and it was my story. So I was immensely proud because he definitely had to overcome quite a bit to have the audacity to write his story. So yes, I definitely understand the weight of the emotions. I really do. There's no getting around it, none whatsoever. And it's wonderful that she has a narrative in her family. A firsthand account is absolutely rare and so very important, because it is those narratives that were written that speak for those who did not have a voice.
Sarah asks, how did William's life end? And are there any records as to whether he was able to reclaim or gain other property or any amount of wealth again?
He never reclaimed or was never able to recapture the amount of wealth that he had in Litchfield. Was he embittered? Yes, I'm sure that he was, but he always tried to make an honest living for his family. He was a barber by profession. He advertised his businesses in the local Connecticut newspapers. He had quite a following. In fact, what we know today, that when his book came out, he took out a full, I don't want to say a full ad, but a sizable ad in one of the Connecticut newspapers, which had the preface of his book, the whole preface that I read an excerpt about. It was in the newspaper, and in the bottom it said, "My book is available in all of the newspapers in New Haven." That was huge. So now we're working on an updated version of the Grimes narrative, or an expanded memoir or biography. We have that much more information today about him, information I didn't have before. So how did his life end? Well, several obituaries wrote about him. The Liberator, the Connecticut Herald, several Connecticut newspapers, and even an obituary was found in California that his children who left Connecticut at the height of the gold rush, and he was even mentioned in newspapers in the West, and even as far away as, well, Connecticut and New York are so close, but New York newspapers as well. So he had quite a following in New Haven. So he may not have died with money, but he certainly died with dignity and respect.
And you mentioned, Regina, all of this other and new information that you're finding. Are there other stories in your family history with William or other ancestors that you're hoping to highlight in the future from your family or other stories that you've come across?
Absolutely. I mentioned that William Grimes' children left Connecticut. Not all of them. I mean, by the way, he had 12 children that survived out of a total of 18 by the same woman. Sounds impossible, but I found in my research that was not unheard of in New Haven. You know, there were white families, prominent families with just as many children. But anyway, his children do leave for the West, and they do quite well. They follow a number of New Englanders, so they didn't come blindly to California, but a wonderful story unfolds there. His youngest daughter, Cecilia Victorian, becomes a locally famous tragedian. She started a colored dramatic troupe. They performed Shakespeare and other dramas and so forth, and she was very well respected. She knew some of the most prominent African Americans in the Bay Area. They started newspapers, literary societies, schools, and whatnot. So there's a much broader story to the Grimes narrative that I am hoping to finish up.
Well, we are looking forward to it. You're always welcome to come back and present to Westport on your new findings. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would say many of our audience members who are here with us tonight are thanking you for coming and joining us, Regina. We have another question from James, who says, your work is remarkable, first of all.
Oh, wow.
And then he would like to know, what was it like for you to go from a book to now having a film about not only William, but about you and your process of finding his story and also continuing your own story?
It seemed like a dream out of reach, but you know, one thing that I've learned from William Grimes is the example that perseverance is definitely a virtue. And it was a struggle to bring Ginas Journey, the search for William Grimes, to life. But I had Sean Durant, a remarkable Bay Area independent filmmaker who knew how to dream big. He didn't have all the answers of how to pull it together, but we found a way to do it. So first of all, I went with it. I'm not one who likes to be in front of a camera. I was compelled to do it because I felt the story just needed to be told. So all of our stories need to be told. There's so many amazing stories out there that don't get in print, don't get in front of a camera, but in some fashion, they do need to be told.
We have another question, and it's actually from Ramin, who you have worked with before, so our director at the museum.
Yes.
And she's wondering if you would speak to what you learned about Connecticut during this process. She says that many people feel Connecticut was a abolitionist state, a Northern Star of freedom. And of course, we know from our research that this is not the case. And she's wondering if you would speak to that a bit.
Absolutely. And it surprised me because I thought the boundaries between North and South were rigid. We were led to believe that the North was where the abolitionist movement grew. We thought that it was the North that saved the South, but in my research, I find that the North was very complicit to slavery and benefited remarkably from slavery in the mills and whatnot. But I also realized how hostile Connecticut was. I think it was the most hostile state out of all the states in New England. And that shocked me. That really shocked me because I was led to believe a different story. As I mentioned earlier, William Grimes was constantly under threat of losing his position in the community as a businessman, fear of constantly being warned out of town because he couldn't make a living there. There were poor whites that felt very entitled to being employed when they were always battling for position. And there was that sense of entitlement among white people who were very threatened by any African American who had an entrepreneurial spirit or were doing better than they were. So yes, and while William Grimes was there, in Connecticut, slavery still existed. He was there, slavery, of course, had the gradual emancipation. So slavery was still going on when William Grimes was there.
You said that surprised you. I think it surprises a lot of, especially people who live in Connecticut, but many people who live in the North, I think, still today. Were there other things that you found during your rediscovery of William's story that really surprised you or struck you?
Oh, there were so many things. I talked about how cruel and barbaric it was in the South. And then we talked a little bit about how it wasn't that much better in the North. In fact, William Grimes concludes his narrative. He says, "I would advise no slave to leave his master." That just shook me. Why? But I came to understand why he said that, because he said he had to work hard, that he was often cheated out of everything. And he felt for any slave to run away to the North, that in the end, you're going to get caught and you're going to wind up back in slavery. So essentially, he was saying there was really no place to be someone. The North probably looked like the land of milk and honey when he heard about it as an enslaved person. He'd go to the North and he thought it would be so much better, but it really wasn't. So that was very surprising to me.
During the museum's exhibition Remembered, we came across a lot of research that we presented that really surprised our audience. I think it's important that the work that we do and the work that you're doing with William are showing people the truth of Connecticut, New England, and of the United States. We do have another question from Greg, who first says that your presentation is deeply compelling, and he says that you are leaping through the Zoom window, thanks you. And he's wondering what personal impact William's story has given you, what your relationship with him and how it has changed your life. He also wants to know what the significance of the clarinet behind you is.
Oh, I love music. I'm a lover of jazz. We'll talk about the clarinet first. The clarinet is an instrument that my husband played in childhood, and eventually both of my daughters played it as well. I think it's a beautiful instrument, and so it is there behind me. Instead of being in a box tucked away somewhere, I wanted to display it. And what was the other? Yeah, please refresh my memory on the other part of the question.
Of course. What the personal impact of learning William's story has been on you and how it's changed your life.
Absolutely. William Grimes picked up the bare bones of reading and writing at a very young age. He doesn't say how he learned, but he gives us clues, okay? I realized that this man, without any formal education, was actually brilliant. And I realized that by extension, his brilliance has to be embedded in my DNA. I'm getting emotional now, as I always do. He talks about if he ever had the chance, he would have done so much more with his life if he had just been given the chance. Well, I realized I had more chances than he had. And I didn't always live up or take advantage of them. And I told myself, I got this. I can do it. It extends to me. So he empowered me. He empowered me in ways that I could not imagine.
We appreciate you sharing your story with us. And
Thank
we
you.
are excited to hear more of your findings when they are ready.
Thank you so much.
The final question that I'd like to leave our program with, and if you have any more, anyone who is tuning in this evening or is seeing this recording later, please do feel free to post questions. My staff and I are always looking for these questions, and we are happy to pass them on to our authors, our speakers, Regina, at a later date. But the final one that I'd like to ask you, Regina, is what should our audience take away from William's story, especially in light of all of the struggle that we are facing today in our society with inequality and racial conflict? What should we take from William?
First of all, I think William would be surprised, or perhaps not, that we are still dealing with the same issues, the same inequality, the same imbalance of wealth and power. There's so much that we could learn from him. We all have a deep desire to just be, we want the same things. We definitely want the same things. The right to live our lives without any sort of bias or judgment. And his narrative definitely reflects that. So it's foundational. The Grimes narrative is foundational for understanding how we came to be what America is today. William Grimes lived through 17 presidents, from George Washington to Johnson. Andrew Johnson. Correct me if I'm wrong. The president of Reconstruction who followed Abraham Lincoln. And there had to be so much promise. William Grimes knew freedom was in the air before he died. I think that he would be so deeply sad to realize that we are not all essentially free in the same way. There is unfortunately an inequity, and Black lives prove that. COVID-19 proves that. And so if we can overcome, and I'm gonna tell you, I see possibilities. I am hopeful. The young people today are out in the streets protesting. It's not only African Americans, it's all nationalities. And that is very hopeful. And it doesn't appear just to be an American dilemma. The support is global. And I think that would please William Grimes today. And it will help us move forward in the future to realizing the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Regina. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience before we sign off for the evening?
Nicole, thank you. Ramin, thank you. It's important for people that come from a very marginalized history to go back and reclaim it, because it will empower you. You will realize that there are virtues inside of you that you never knew existed based upon the strength of your heritage. And then once you reclaim that, you know who you are. You can articulate it in a way that you never could before, and people will listen. it's empowering. So that's what I want to leave the audience. And I want us all to be hopeful for a better day. And I am hopeful for a better day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina, and have a great evening, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much for joining us.
Again, thank you.